heat in Round Rock did not merely shine, it pressed. It pressed the leaves on the live oaks into stillness and made the limestone fronts pulse with mirage. Across Brushy Creek, the Round Rock that christened the town sat ankle-deep in glittering water, the same low crossing that had ushered cattle herds up the Chisholm feeder for a decade. Downstream, the rails had pulled commerce east, laying out neat blocks, and what locals called Newtown was unfurling. Dry goods, a livery, a barber's chair, and a general store with a bell above its door. On such a July afternoon, three trail-dusted men stepped off the sun-baked street and into the shade, looking for tobacco and a breath of cool air, and brought with them the last of Sam Bass's luck. Before we get there, before the bell rings and a deputy asks a quiet question about pistols, step back with me. Sam Bass was born in Indiana in 1851, orphaned young, and learned early that the world took as often as it gave. He drifted like so many did, following rumor and wages, first to a sawmill in Rosedale, Mississippi, then on to Denton, Texas in 1870. There he found the daylight work, breaking horses, hauling freight for Sheriff Egan, and the twilight temptations of saloons, racing stables, and dice. The frontier paid best if you could make your own odds. Bass discovered he liked that. Denton gave him a talisman, a fast mare the locals christened the Denton Mare. That horse laid down stakes for him, race by race, until the winnings dwindled and the old thrills soured into expenses. In 1876, he and Joel Collins drove Longhorns north, sold out, and instead of returning the proceeds to the ranchers who'd fronted the herd, they carried $8,000 into the bright gambling halls of Ogallala and Deadwood and let the money run. When it ran out, they were broke men wearing the scent of risk, looking for a stake. In 1877, stakes came with barrels and iron wheels. Picture a lonely water stop near present-day Big Springs, Nebraska, on September 18, 1877. The Union Pacific Express slows in the dark. The telegraph has been cut, the station man cowed, and a band of six moves like knife blades through lamplight. They find little in the way safe. And then someone notices three wooden crates near the main safe. Inside, new $20 gold pieces, straight from the San Francisco Mint, bound east. $60,000 glitters like sunlight poured into a coach. The gang lifts the coin and a little more, watches, pocket money, then splits by twos to vanish into the prairie. No shots fired, just a story too bright to stay quiet. From that night on, Sam Bass traveled quicker than a postal schedule. Bass made it back to Texas in farmer's clothes, and before long, remade a gang. The spring of 1878 around Dallas reads like a bad habit. Allen's Station in February, Hutchins in March, Eagle Ford and Mesquite in April. Modest hauls, sloppy execution, but a rhythm that mocked the railroads. Newspapers followed him the way crows track a plow. Texas, wounded and wary after years of political turmoil, heard the drumbeat and answered with a reforged instrument. The Texas Rangers Frontier Battalion, 6 companies of hard men shaped into a state's will. At the top stood Major John B. Jones, not flashy, not fast, but dogged as drought. He would ride this story into Round Rock. Round Rock, meanwhile, had its own hinge to swing upon. For years, the Chisholm feeder crossed Brushy Creek at the literal Round Rock. Table flat, a promise of shallow footing for iron-rimmed wheels and skittish cattle. Then in 1876, the International and Great Northern Railroad came in on the south side, and the town's heart followed. Merchants shifting from flood-bit Old Town to rail-friendly New Town. Boardwalks shouldering limestone, a place remade by timetables and whistles. On paper, at least, it was a lawful place. Texas had said so in ink. In 1871, the legislature passed a strict statute curbing the public carry of pistols, open or concealed in many circumstances, and towns enforced it with quiet firmness. In other words, a deputy in Newtown who spotted a bulge beneath a stranger's coat didn't need a name to start a conversation. He had the law, and he had a duty. Law and duty, though, live in bodies that feel heat and heartbeat. By mid-July of 1878, Bass's gang wasn't merely hunted, it was unraveling. Jim Murphy, small and sharp, had been squeezed by ranger arrests and federal mail robbery charges. He agreed to ride with Bass again, and to write to Major Jones about where that ride would end. The letter pointed to Round Rock, to a small bank in a town where a stranger might disappear into the shuffle of freight wagons and trail dust. Jones sent rangers to watch. He rode in himself with a Travis County deputy named Morris B. Moore, and then the clock began to tick. It's worth pausing here on what town felt like in 1878. Round Rock breathed both cattle and commerce. In Old Town, wagon ruts still scarred the limestone bed where the crossing bit into the creek. In Newtown, a barber stropped his razor and a storekeeper arranged tins and tobacco. The frontier wasn't a mythic stage. It was a texture of ordinary things: rope, sweat, lye soap, rolled newsprint, the metallic whisper of a six-gun being shifted on a belt to keep from printing through a coat. The law was not an abstraction either. It was a man who'd put on his badge that morning because someone had to, and because the statute said a pistol in town was the sovereign's business. Sam Bass had moved through places like this for years, talking when talk would do, digging in when it wouldn't. People who knew him remembered the smile, the air of a gambler who liked his odds even when he shouldn't. Those odds were shrinking. In Dallas County and beyond, he had become too famous to be free for long. That is the paradox of the outlaw. The more you live by speed and shadow, the more the world learns your shape. He crossed the street in Round Rock with two men and, in one version of the story, the ranger's eyes slid over them without alarm. Perhaps it was the hats or the heat or just the ordinary look of three men buying tobacco. The bell jingled. A deputy named Ahijah W. Cage Grimes stepped in to ask a simple question. Fate answered with the complicated kind. Did Bass know how close the net lay? Did he sense the letter that had gone ahead of him like a thrown knife? The town had two centers that day, one marked by a round rock in a creek, the other by a general store doorway. Between them ran 100 yards of open air, where the old trail world and the new rail world overlapped. Bass had always prospered in seams like that. He was a rail robber who loved trail country, a charmer who ran with hard men, a fellow who'd swear to his friends that he wouldn't blow on them even when the price of silence was mortal. The heat pressed. The barrels of three pistols stayed hidden for the moment. A lawman did his job, and the West, as it so often did, prepared to turn from ordinary to legend in the span of a breath. Before Round Rock became the hinge of a legend, Sam Bass learned how a crowd leans forward when a man flirts with the edge of chance. Denton taught him that. The town was half trail dust, half courthouse steps, a place where the law shook hands with the wager. In daylight, he freighted and broke horses, steady work that kept the belly full and the conscience quiet. After dark, he haunted the tracks and saloons, where the lamps were low and the money moved faster than the talk. Folks remembered the grin first, and then the animal, a swift bay the county took to calling the Denton Mare. She ran as if the ground would lift to meet her. With Bass up, she wore local purses like a string of brass buttons. The winnings felt clean, and then they didn't. Every man who rides a hot streak learns the same cold lesson. Luck has a mortgage, and the note always comes due. So Bass chased bigger stakes the way drought chases smoke. In 1876, he and a friend, Joel Collins, pushed a herd north along the long river of cattle trailing toward railheads in Nebraska and the Black Hills trade that spun around Deadwood like filings to a magnet. When the beeves turned into dollars, they carried that money into Ogallala and Deadwood, towns where the floors never seemed level and the dice never seemed square. The nights blurred, the lamps hissed, the piano clanged a brittle cheer from some corner, and then one morning the money was gone. The partners stood in shirt sleeves, broke and blinking, and the plain arithmetic of the frontier stared back. A man could go home empty, or he could make his own stake. They chose a third option, risk masked as resolve. Out there on the high plains, the Union Pacific ran like a vein through a dark body, pulsing with passenger fare and payrolls, express packages and coin. Schedules were predictable, water stops even more so. The railroad's clockwork made life efficient for commerce, and for anyone who'd learned to read timetables with a wolf's patience. Somewhere along that line, a messenger handled a small safe and a way safe inside the express car. A telegraph operator sent and received the hum of a continent. The station lamps drew moths and men in equal measure. If a gang cut the wire and owned the lamp for a single midnight, they could own the coin that rode behind it. That was the plan in the fall of 1877 when 6 riders, including Bass and Collins, began watching a lonely water station near Big Springs, Nebraska. The night came on all at once, as prairie nights do. Wind slipped under the eaves. The engine hissed down from the grade and sighed to a stop for water, iron cooling with little knocks like a smith shop at rest. The telegraph had been silenced. The operator kept his eyes down. The station lantern was a gold circle that obeyed another man's hand. Out of that circle moved the bandits, hats low, coats drawn, voices quiet and level. A messenger opened the safe. There was some cash, a disappointed murmur, nothing to justify the danger. Then someone noticed 3 wooden crates on the floor. The lids came up, and moonlight seemed to spill out. Inside lay newly minted $20 gold pieces from the San Francisco Mint. Stamped, perfect, heavy with the kind of promise that convinces a man he's been chosen. $60,000 is not a fortune so much as a temptation magnified, and temptations possess their own gravity. The coins were sacked, the watches and pocket bills gathered as if they were seeds to be planted in quieter soil. Shots were not necessary. Respect and fear could do the work of bullets if you used the voice right. When dawn went looking for the gang, it found only hoofprints running out in pairs. That was by design. The prairie is good at erasing. The telegraph is good at remembering. By noon, the wire was buzzing, and the newspapers were already writing an introduction for Sam Bass to the rest of America. Train robbery had a way of making instant celebrities and instant enemies. Editors loved the symmetry of it. Modern speed met frontier audacity, and Bass's name traveled from column to column like a lit fuse. Here was a gambler who had gambled well. The story went, robbing without blood, riding with a certain panache. The truth was cooler. A poor man with a talent for nerve had learned that the railroad's regular heartbeat offered its own weaknesses. They scattered and hid, and they quarreled. And they counted money in too many rooms where thin walls kept secrets poorly. A few of the men who rode north with Bass would not ride very long. The plains were filling with posses, and the temptation to spend brought lawmen close as flies to a brand new cut. In time, Bass turned his horse back toward Texas, dressed in farmer's clothes, a disguise so ordinary it was almost elegant. If he looked like anyone at all, no one would recall him in detail later. That was the trick, to be a ghost in the daylight and a rumor at night. Texas, meanwhile, had not stood still. The rails had multiplied like roots under a spring pasture, driving stakes into Dallas County and the towns strung along the line. Allen Station, Hutchins, Eagle Ford, Mesquite. Those names did not yet ring like bells. They were mileposts of commerce and habit. The express cars that passed them carried coin, paper, parcels, sometimes payrolls. Not always much. Certainly not every run was a feast, but enough to make a man like Bass keep a calendar in his head. And if a crew could force a stop, or board the car near a depot, or turn the geometry of track, lantern, and pistol to their favor, a small haul could feel like a hand on fortune's shoulder. Bass stitched together such hauls the way a rider stitches up a rent in his coat, crude, serviceable, and just good enough to see him into the next week. But nothing in Texas goes unanswered for long. The state was still finding its balance after years when politics had felt like a slow fever. Citizens wanted steadiness. Railroads wanted respect. In between stood the Rangers. Old name, new purpose. The Frontier Battalion, under Major John B. Jones, had been hammered into shape not for theatrics, but for results. Jones was not a gunspinner. He was a maker of systems, a rider who preferred a map to a boast. He knew that outlaws overrated their speed and underrated the reach of a patient man with informants in time. Bass would eventually meet that patience the hard way, but first he indulged his habit. One more job, one more night when a pocket full of coin could buy anonymity and breathing room. Dallas County gave him just enough success to sharpen the teeth of pursuit. A modest grab at Allen Station became an item in a column. Hutchins added another paragraph. Eagle Ford and Mesquite produced ink and a few dollars, and a reputation that grew faster than any of the hauls justified. The public, always hungry for shape and story, began to fit Bass for a costume he had not exactly ordered. Dashing, quick with a smile, almost genteel in his thieving. Those who tracked him preferred plainer language. Persistent, addicted to risk, slippery. He'd robbed without killing, which made him easier to sing about. Songs do not much like ruin. They prefer charm and distance. Around him, the tools of the age flexed their muscle. The telegraph outran horses, rail timetables organized towns, the way bells once organized monasteries. The press, newly voracious, could elevate a petty criminal into a figure to love or loathe by the time a sheriff had saddled up. That was the advantage and the trap. Bass needed the railroad's predictability and the public's indifference. The same predictability and curiosity were teaching his hunters how to move in on him. He could not see it all plainly yet, only feel it as a change in the air. The way a man senses a norther before it drops the temperature by 20 degrees in an afternoon. So he did what gamblers always do when the table begins to frown. He doubled down on familiar ground. Texas had given him the talent for reading faces indoors, for knowing when a storekeeper's eyes flicker to a side room where a clerk counts the till, for smelling when a depot man stiffens, not from fear, but from resolve. He trimmed his mustache, he changed his coat, he learned to keep his voice a shade lower, to ask for tobacco in the same even tone 100 men used in 100 towns. When you become a headline, the work of staying free is mostly the work of becoming ordinary again. Yet the Wire kept humming his name. A ranger or a deputy would ride into some settlement at dusk and find the day's papers already calling for his capture. A telegraph key would clatter out a rumor that he'd been seen east of town, and a team would be in the saddle inside the hour. Bass's old friend Joel Collins was not there to steady the hand. Partners changed. Loyalty thinned. North of Austin, a smaller town straddled the seam of past and future. Cattle trail crossing the creek at a Round Rock. New storefronts facing a new line of track. A plan took shape, modest in promise, perfect in risk. A bank in Round Rock would do, small enough to crack without blood, Bass told himself, brisk enough to keep them in coin and newsprint a while longer. He could not know how thoroughly his own circle had been pierced. Jim Murphy, a writer with too much to lose, was writing letters in a careful hand, folding them twice, addressing them to Major John B. Jones. The letters didn't guess. They told. They named Round Rock. They gave the shape of the days ahead like a weather report. And so, as Bass nudged his horse along the same road that trails and rails had limbed into the countryside, the Rangers slipped into town ahead of him and found places to wait. The Wire was quiet about that. It is the habit of telegraphs and newspapers to record the bang, not the breath before it. The breath belongs to men in doorways, to a bell on a general store, to a deputy smoothing his coat where a badge catches the light, and to a gambler who believes he can still outrun a calendar. The night trains kept their schedules. The cottonwoods along Brushy Creek held their leaves as if a hand had been laid on them. Somewhere in the darkness, a mare shifted, tasting water, stamping at a fly. At dawn, the streets would bake again, and by afternoon, 3 men would cross to a store whose bell had a polite voice. What the newspapers would later call the Round Rock Standoff began not with thunder, but with routine. A town between trail and rail, a plan small enough to seem safe, and the fate that always waits when a man mistakes quiet for permission. By the time spring light found the bottoms around Dallas, the name Sam Bass moved ahead of itself like heat shimmer on a section of track. He and his shifting circle tested the seams where timetable certainty met nightfall nerve. Allen Station first, jerky, quick, not much to brag on. Then Hutchins, Eagle Ford, Mesquite, a rash of modest strikes that made the railroads look slow and the sheriffs look late. Nothing grand, nothing like the minted sunburst at Big Springs, but the persistence gnawed. An express messenger who had once smirked at talk of bandits now kept his hand near the way-safe key, and conductors new to the division learned the rule no timetable prints. Keep your eyes soft but your ears hard, because a quiet platform carries the news of a pistol, the way a pond carries the shape of a thrown stone. Outlawry rarely looks like a ballad while it's happening. It looks like sweat drying on a shirt, a horse blowing hard, coin counted too fast by lamplight, quarrels over whose luck bled into whose trouble. Bass gathered and lost men the way a river gathers and loses driftwood, some of them stout and serviceable, some liable to sink when the current changed. He had an instinct for choosing nights when the sky seemed to listen, but not repeat. That instinct had carried him this far. It would carry him, too, to the edge of a town where the law had daylight friends. Texas had been learning to stand up again after years when many a courthouse felt like a chessboard for faraway hands. Folks wanted less spectacle and more peace. The state's answer was practical. Find a man who prized steadiness over swagger and give him the bridle hand. Major John B. Jones, commander of the Texas Rangers Frontier Battalion, wasn't the sort to let a rumor write his plan. He read reports the way a river pilot reads eddies, feeling where the pull lay, how the current wanted to throw a boat against a hidden snag. He took the battalion's scattered habits and drilled them into a method. Keep the horses ready, keep your men lean and literate in the land, state your business to county officers without playing the bully, and lean on informants until the talk produced a map you could ride before the ink went dry. There is a kind of pressure only the hunted know. You begin to notice how coffee smells different in towns that have read your name in a headline. You feel eyes that would have slid past you last winter. Pause for half a second longer on your boots, your hat brim, the outline your coat makes when wind presses it to your belt. The men nearby are not quite the same men they were when the money ran easier. One has a cough he can't shake. Another drinks in the afternoon. A third laughs too loud at unfunny things because quiet makes his ears ring. Into that weather came Jim Murphy, thin, watchful, saddled with charges heavy enough to bend a spine. He rode with Bass. He also walked into rooms where a ranger or a federal man waited and came out paler, blinking. Then letters began to move along the post roads, folded clean, marked to reach Major Jones's hand. They were not florid. They were not guesses. They told, and what they told was place and time, a small bank, a town with two centers, old and new, sewn together by a round rock and a creek and a rail that promised tomorrow. Professionalizing sounds like a word made for offices, but in Jones's hands it meant simple field truths. Don't make a crowd if a whisper will do. Don't fire if a badge can walk into a doorway and speak plain. But when it's time for speed, don't let pride be the last thing through the door. He shaped his companies into a hinge between county lawmen and state purpose, respecting local badges, refusing to let the Rangers be a roaming theater troupe with cocked hats and louder mouths than results. In the wake of Reconstruction, that mattered. Order had to look like order, not vengeance. Jones knew that killing an outlaw is one thing, ending a season of outlawry another. You end a season by denying the outlaw a stage. The stage Bass wanted shrank from depot platforms to crossroads stores, from bold express jobs to small-town banks where courage might suffice if luck cooperated. The Dallas robberies had fed headlines that made politics hungry, and politics had made Jones busy. Meanwhile, the Telegraph tapped day and night through the line crew's shacks and division offices, turning Texas into something new. A place whose distances could be crossed by information of faster than a man could cross them by horse. Outlaws who survived on a landscape's former silence found themselves spoken about, sketched from memory, trailed not only by posses, but by descriptions in newsprint vivid enough that a station agent could look past his own caution and say, "Stranger, I believe I've seen that hat before." Bass kept moving, because movement is the only prayer a hunted man can say without words. South and a bit west, then back north to feel for the seam again, always sounding the ground for that faint drum of opportunity. The men closest to him learned his tells. The way he went quiet when a plan came into focus. The way his eyes softened when talk turned to a horse he admired. He liked animals and respected women, and was entirely capable of stepping across a line he had no right to cross if money sat just over it. The charm was not counterfeit. That's what made it dangerous. A handsome man with a grin can talk a skittish hostler into one more favor. A dangerous man with quiet hands can empty an express car faster than a loud fool who loves the sound of his own threat. Ranger scouts spiderwebbed the counties he favored. They asked after tobacco orders and livery stalls, how many strangers had come through of an evening, whether anyone bought cartridges without a story to tell about coyotes and fences. The questions were never shouted. Questions sound truer when spoken in a voice pitched for a porch. Where a town needed shoring up, Jones loaned a spine. Where a sheriff had good men, he offered not to outshine but to strengthen. The battalion's reputation changed shape under him. From a band of fierce riders who answered when called to a constant presence, whose very rumor calmed rough streets. Somewhere inside that weather, The pressure on Bass became a system rather than a series of close calls. Systems win more often than hunches. If he felt the net tightening, the gambler in him felt something else too. The old tilt of a table just before the dice fall in his favor. He told himself a small target meant a small war. Round Rock wasn't Dallas with its talkative depots and itchy wires. It had country in its breath. A bank there would be quick work. Ride in ordinary, step inside, a polite voice, a hard moment, then out again with enough coin to turn a few weeks of breathing room into a season. The calculus didn't account for a man with one foot in his camp and the other in Major Jones's shadow. Murphy's letters gave the Rangers shape and pace. When to drift in, where to lean, which doorway a deputy should own as if born to it. The plan wasn't a grand trap with theatrical flourishes. Those make good broadsides and bad results. It was a pocket full of placements and the confidence to let local badges be seen. In Round Rock, that mattered more than a poster ever could. Towns run on what they believe about themselves. Newtown believed it had become a place where business could be transacted without a hand on a pistol. Old Town believed the trail still had a say. Both were right. That meant both would be present when history decided to turn. There's a rhythm to a pursuit when both sides are competent. You feel it in the pauses. Bass slowed fractionally as summer pressed down. The Rangers slowed a hair less. He chose a weekday when traffic would be ordinary. They chose to be ordinary one day earlier. A barber's chair in Newtown saw its share of rumors. A general store clerk set out a row of tins, attentive to the door, but unwilling to be obvious about it. A lawman stroked the nap of his coat over a badge so the brass wouldn't flash in the wrong eye at the wrong second. The law in this moment was mostly patience. North of Austin, the roads carry a soft white dust that turns to plaster when sweat meets it. Horses know the taste. Bass's horse did too. He rode with Seaborn Barnes and Frank Jackson, both steady in their own ways. Barnes with the fatalism of a man who doesn't expect to die old. Jackson with the practical courage of a partner who keeps his eyes open and his mouth shut. They had ridden in and out of towns for months as nobodies. On this day, in this heat, they were nobodies who had been named ahead of their arrival. Between the brush on one side and the rail on the other, the path narrowed to the ordinary width of an American main street, and the difference between a plan and an epitaph shrank to the breadth of a doorway and the sound a bell makes when a hand touches wood. Men like Bass always imagine one last clean job before arrest. Men like Jones imagine there won't be one. Somewhere between those imaginations, Round Rock waited, untheatrical and sunstruck, ready to enforce a statute about pistols and a custom about minding your own business. Custom yielding, statute standing. The three riders nudged their mounts, swung down, and crossed the street without hurry. If a god watched, it was the small-town god that lives in such crossings, the one that blesses clerks, lawmen, and gamblers alike with routine, until routine splits and the truth of a life shows in how a man lays his hand on a six-gun when another man says, "Sir, I'll need you to hand me that pistol now." The bell over the general store had a modest voice, the sort of sound a town learns to ignore until the day a story walks through and claims it. The three riders crossed the street as if they had crossed 100 just like it. Dust combed off their coats by July light, the smell of harness oil and sun-warmed leather in their wake. Round Rock's law was no rumor. It had been spoken into the town's bones since '71. Pistols off, tempers low, business first. So when Deputy Ahijah W. K.G. Grimes eased the door and let the bell give its polite ring, he did not arrive as a dare, but as a courtesy backed by statute. He found three strangers among the tobacco tins and calico, their hats set low, the familiar weight of iron poorly hidden beneath cloth. He asked the steady question every badge in Texas had learned to ask. "Gentlemen, I'll be taking those pistols." Perhaps there was a beat of silence the size of a coin. Perhaps a glance went wrong. What happened next happened always the same way in towns like this. Faster than memory, slower than consequence. A hand moved, the shine of a six-gun cylinder flashed like a signal mirror, and the still air shattered. Shots cracked in the wood-scented aisles, jars trembled on their shelving, the bell rang again without any hand upon it. Grimes staggered, 1, 2, more impacts thudding into cloth and bone, and went down among the ordinary goods he had sworn to keep safe. The doorway he had meant to dignify became a place of dying. Outside, Deputy Maurice B. Moore had been minding the threshold, the old dance of one man in and one man out. The first report hit him like an insult. He plunged through the door and fired as he closed. Clean, fast, and at close range, the way old cavalry sergeants teach. A ball tore through Sam Bass's right hand and smashed the bones there, the sort of wound that lives in a man's future even when he outlives the day. Moore took a round in the chest for his trouble and reeled, chest gasping like a bellows kicked open. He would live, though the breath he won back would always remind him of this hour. Blood answered blood, and the general store's shelves, orderly that morning, watched their columns break into chaos. Down the block, a barber held a razor at a ranger's jaw, in a room smelling of bay rum and lather. Richard Dick Ware, face half soaped, snapped his head from the towel at the first volley. The barber jumped. Ware was already on his feet. White suds slashed across one cheek like war paint. He ran into the street buttoning nothing, the floor of the shop still wet under his boots. A good ranger carries calm like a second weapon. Ware brought us up with a motion that said this was not the first time he'd had to be both quick and cold. Somewhere near the store's frontage, Major John B. Jones stepped into the sun and did the thing a commander rarely does. He fired a single measured shot, not to own the tale, but to join it, to put his authority in the same air his men were breathing. The street woke at once. A liveryman flattened behind a hitch rail. A shop girl slid to the floor and prayed into her fist. A one-armed citizen known as Stubbs saw Grimes down and did what men do when duty trembles without a hand to hold it. He reached for the fallen deputy's pistol, felt the knowledge of its heft leap up his arm, and entered the fight as if the badge could be borrowed with the weapon. Rounds ricocheted from limestone fronts, chopped splinters off a sign, ripped through a bolt of cloth that bloomed like a flag behind a counter. The smell of black powder filled the midday, a hot, bitter incense that has christened more western towns than any preacher. Seaborn Barnes moved with the fatal quickness of a man who expects to be measured by seconds rather than years. He threw his fire across the doorway to cover the retreat and caught fate in return. Ware's revolver spoke, and Barnes folded where he stood, his body refusing another order. The town would later talk about the neatness of that shot, about how a ranger with lather on his cheek had put an end to the wildest heart on the street. Men who have to make such shots don't often talk about neatness. They talk about necessity. Bass, bleeding from the ruined hand, still had the gambler's instincts that had kept him alive across 1,000 small moments. Pain does not make a plan for you. It only tells you you're late. He and Frank Jackson lunged for the alley where their horses waited, the light there knifed into bars by outbuildings and awning posts. The world narrowed to leather and buckles, to reins you suddenly cannot manage with a hand that no longer obeys. A rifle cracked from farther down, measured unhurried, and Ranger George Herold, posted like a stake at the edge of the killing ground, believed his shot took Bass in the waist or side as the outlaws tried to mount. Tradition would gift Ware the fatal credit and Herold the steady alternative. Round Rock would keep both versions like two keys to the same trunk, either one opening the past a little, neither locking it shut. What is certain is what the dust would still tell you if you could stir that afternoon up from the ground like a kept thing. Barnes lay dead. Grimes lay dying, or dead. Accounts vary by a minute, not a verdict, and Deputy Moore was white-lipped but upright enough to be lifted and carried. Stubbs, one arm and all, had turned a citizen's heart to use. Jones had done a commander's rare work. Ware had come out of the barber's chair into a gunfight and not missed the moment. And Bass, who had once ridden out of towns with songs looking for him, rode this time out with the taste of iron and failure in his mouth, his horse shouldering into the alley's heat, while Jackson grabbed the bridle and got him pointed toward survival. Some gunfights last long enough to have chapters. This one had a single page and a dozen claims. The last echoes chased themselves down the block and died among rain barrels. Townsfolk surfaced from cover as if from deep water. A clerk peered through a shattered pane and saw the street as if for the first time, a place where order had been asked a question and answered loudly. The barber stood in his doorway, towel in hand, looking at the smear of soap along Ware's path as though it might explain something. A woman hurried with a basin toward the place where a deputy's badge had fallen against wood. She did not cry until she had to set the basin down. Men cut strips from their own shirts to staunch holes in a lawman they knew by first name. In the alley, the horses blew and stamped, alive to the strange arithmetic of a sudden flight. Jackson's courage that day wore no ornament. It looked like efficiency. He swung Bass into the saddle with the kind of urgency that doesn't admit bravado, turned the horse's head toward the northwestern pasture, and did the simplest mathematics an outlaw ever does. One more mile, one more rise, one more chance at a tree line that would take them into brush and breath and choices. Behind them, the Rangers reset to the kind of pursuit that begins not with a shout, but with refilled cylinders and the cold tally of who was missing, who was hurt, and who had to be told. In the hours that followed, Round Rock became a ledger. Names entered it: A.W. Grimes in one column, Seaborn Barnes in another, Maurice B. Moore in a third, with a notation that he still breathed. The line for fatal shot refused to take a single name in ink. It took two side by side, Ware, Herold, and let the town decide at supper which told it truer. A few men swore they had seen Jones's bullet bite stone right by an outlaw's heel, a warning shaped like accuracy. Others carried forward the barber's tale, the lather becoming a kind of heraldry for a ranger who ran toward trouble without pausing to wipe his face. Such details are not trifles. They are the bits memory uses to keep a story walking. And all the while, just beyond the tidy blocks of Newtown, heat lay over the bottoms, cicadas grinding time into a rasp. Old Town watched from across Brushy Creek like a witness with a different accent, remembering when law on a summer afternoon was mostly a handshake and a promise. Between those two centers, trail past and rail tomorrow, the standoff at a store that some accounts call Copperall's and others Copples settled into the dust as both violence and verdict. The law had not called for a hanging tree. It had called for a bell on a door, a deputy's voice, and when that failed, a street full of men who held their nerve. By sundown, the town had learned who was not coming home for supper. A wife's face closed like a shutter. A ranger's hands stopped shaking only when they had work again to occupy them. Riders fanned the countryside, pressing toward the road that bent northwest. Somewhere beyond the last fence, a hurt man and his partner tried to beat the dark to a hiding place. Between them rode all the questions the West loves to ask in low rooms. Who fired first? Who fired straightest? And what does a man owe to his friends when the price of loyalty is taller than he is? The answers would not come on the street. They would come, if at all, in a cattle pasture at daybreak, where even a talker learns the silence that waits at the end of a legend. They left the ordered grid of Newtown like men falling out of a photograph. Behind them, the bell over the door would never sound ordinary again. Ahead, the ground rose in low swells patched with cedar and live oak, each shadow promising more distance than it held. Frank Jackson rode a half-length close to Sam Bass, talking with his hands because speech jarred Bass's face into a wince. The right hand that had done so much casual business with dice and reins now gushed and stuck. The bones a scrambled code under torn flesh. Every hoofbeat sent a wire of pain up his arm and across his ribs where a second shot felt like a burning coin lodged under skin. It was not yet mortal, not yet surely anything, and a gambler can live a long way on not yet. They threaded the scrub where the creek cut back on itself, skirting the old crossing, because riders with dust on them become silhouettes against water at dusk, and silhouettes attract lead. Jackson did the watching for them both. He watched the road for the dark flick of movement that announces a rider who means to matter. He watched the light for that last change when the sun gives up color and the world turns to iron. He watched Bass the way a man watches a lantern whose glass is cracked, fearing not only that the flame will go out, but that it will suddenly flare and take the whole place with it. A wounded outlaw can be a danger to his friends. Bass was not dangerous now. He was too tired to be anything but heavy. Old Town tilted its face from across Brushy Creek like an elder who has seen too much and says too little. A child in a tree along a fence line, told later she had never before been allowed to stay up into the blaze of late afternoon, held her breath while the two strangers slid past. Years later, someone would claim Jackson turned his head and made a small motion with his chin, an instruction no one needed and still obeyed. Get down. Whether that happened or not, the memory pleased Round Rock. Towns keep such details the way families keep heirlooms, not for their monetary worth, but for the sense that life, even in its ugliest seconds, can be made a touch braver by a tiny courtesy. Pasture took them, then a thicket, then a dry draw that smelled of dust and ironweed. They paused only when silence insisted on being listened to, the hush that lands after a burst of flight when every leaf comes back into focus. Jackson slid down and checked the cinches, then pulled a rag from his pocket and wound Bass's hand into a more useful shape. He was gentle as a farrier with a good horse's bad foot. The blood found its way around the new wrapping anyway. Bass tried to joke and couldn't. The sound that came out of him was a bark of air that made the wound tighten in complaint. He nodded instead, a kind of apology for being the weight that he was. Night in July does not cool quickly. It settles a layer of heat over the ground as if to save it for morning. They moved again, and now every yard had to be purchased. Once a shape slid across the sky, and both men froze, heads angled like listening animals. But it was only a heron lifting from a snag. More than once Bass pulled the rein wrong with the wrong hand, and the horse snatched its head and hopped sideways, affronted. Jackson reached and steadied the bit, murmuring to the animal with the same voice a man uses with a skittish child. A mile gained, then two, then the sense that miles had ceased to mean much at all, and what counted was not being seen between any two particular fence posts. Somewhere in that darkening, the future split into two paths, the one the legend would tell, and the one the night dictated. Jackson had choices, and none were pure. He could keep on with Bass until speed and chance, and a good turn of brush made the difference. He could leave him now and make the best of his own life's chance while it still belonged to him. Or he could do the thing men do when debt is written in something thicker than ink. Get a hurt friend into a place where the morning, if it came with lawmen, would at least find him breathing and treated as a man, not as a carcass. It was not theatrical, it was practical. They stopped again where a shallow fold in the land laid them down out of sight. Jackson took Bass's canteen away and then gave it back in sips, because a man close to shock will drown himself on his own thirst if you let him. Bass blinked and tried to find words. If there were any speeches, no one wrote them down. If there were any promises, they were the soft sort that get made with a hand on a forearm. Jackson's shadow stood and moved as if detached from him. He led Bass's horse into a thin stand of oak on ground, pinched up into a kind of cradle. Then he looped the reins low and tight, a hitch that says stay, patted the animal's neck, and eased back. Bass's head had lolled against the saddle blanket. The night clicked and ticked around them. When Jackson climbed up again, the sound was the sound men hear in dreams after a parting. Leather whispering, stirrup iron, a soft curse. Then it was only the crickets. Dawn made its slow promise. It came in gray, then pearl, then the kind of yellow that doesn't belong to anyone yet. A local posse took the morning like a job that had to be done and spread into the pastures that had taken the night. They found Bass because the land is generous with rumors and stingy with hiding places. He was not dramatic when they came on him. He was a man waking into the sort of pain that erases everything it doesn't need. The blood on his shirt had dried into stiff petals. His right hand, when they unwrapped it, had settled into a shape that obeyed neither instruction nor pity. He did not argue when water was offered, only made the small noises of someone whose throat keeps remembering dust. They put him on a horse and did what men do when death is present, but not commanding yet. They tried. The town, which had seen the worst kind of suddenness the day before, became very careful. A room was found, a shack near the crossroads, not the grand house of anyone's memory, just a place where a body could be laid down and looked at properly. A doctor worked with clean hands and the tools of his trade, the old ones and the newer ones, needle and thread, and the quiet authority that stops a room from filling with the wrong sort of talk. A lawman's voice found the corners of the place. Outside, riders stood off a little, because you do not crowd the last square yard a man may own. Major John B. Jones came and sat where he could be seen without having to announce himself. Commanders learn that the dying do not owe them an audience. You come as a man first, then as your rank. He asked the necessary things in the necessary order. Who else rode? Where are they headed? Where did you stable last? The questions were not insults. They were the rope he had in his hands to pull others back from whatever cliff they might be riding toward. Bass was polite the way a man is when his energy is a small coin he spends carefully. He did not dress his refusal in speeches. He used an old professional word, spoken without heat. "It's against my profession to blow on my pals." It was as if he were explaining a rule of a game no one else had any reason to play. A little later, hours are hard to count in rooms like that, he allowed a thing that hadn't been nailed down yet. If Grimes died by his hand, he said, "He was the first man I ever killed." The sentence hung in the room like a coat someone meant to carry off and didn't. The doctor kept working. The law kept asking until asking became unkind and then stopped. Outside, the town's own arithmetic continued. A coffin was prepared. A clerk wrote down names on a sheet whose purpose was not yet decided. A woman brought a basin and a cloth and then took them away and brought them back again because hands need something to do or they will twist themselves into knots. Children were told to stay indoors. A ranger who had fired his gun that afternoon in front of a store now sat on a step and looked at nothing for a while and then at his boots, which had powder soot ground into cracks where polish would not reach. The barber washed his towel twice and still it smelled of lather and fear. Hour by hour, the July heat turned the shack into a bell jar, then into a confessional. A priest was not necessary. A man who knows his account is closing can do his own sums. Bass spoke sparingly. Pain leaves a person without interest in decoration. He answered when the doctor asked and closed his eyes when the questions wore boot heels. If he thought of the boy from Indiana, or of the Denton Mare, or of a cool saloon at dusk where the dice sounded like luck tapping on a bar, he did so with his face turned to the wall. If he wished he had ridden any mile differently, he did not say. There is pride in silence and also mercy. On the third day, time gathered itself. The sound in the room changed. Not the doctor's voice or the murmur of men outside, but the smaller music of a body finding its end. The lungs lost their schedule. The pulse, that stubborn drum that had defied more than one bad bet, began to tap as if through a door. Someone remarked, not loudly, not triumphantly, that the date was July 21st. A few of the men realized at the same instant that the figure on the bed was 27 years old. The coincidence moved across the room like a gust that barely troubles the curtains. Bass did not rise for a final declaration. He rode out as he had ridden in, quietly with more pain than anyone deserves, and with his last promise still unbroken. They wrapped him for the road to the cemetery that had owned its share of silence before this and would own more after. In a few hours, the stonecutters and the storytellers would have work. Different crafts, same impulse. But for a moment, the town gave up its appetite for talk and let the air say what it could. The Rangers gathered themselves into the posture of men who will be asked for statements and will provide facts instead of the hopes others want. The doctor washed his hands with long, slow movements that looked like prayer. Major Jones stepped out into the light and set his hat on his head with care. No cheer rose, no verdict either, only the low sound a place makes when it adds a new weight to its history and feels the timbers take it. Night came again, and this time it cooled. The road out of town was the same road in, as always, and somewhere on it a single rider traveled without speaking, because men who have done a hard kindness do not narrate it to themselves until much later. The creek slid past the Round Rock as if nothing in the world had changed, and in one sense nothing had. The West still asked the same questions of its men. What will you do for coin? What will you refuse for a friend? How much heat can a body bear before the truth is spoken or withheld forever? Round Rock had heard one set of answers in gunfire. It heard the rest in a small room where a dying man kept his counsel, and the law, for once, did not insist on taking it. They put the town to rights as best they could. Boards went over splintered windows. The storekeeper counted what could be counted and left the rest to God. The barber rinsed his bowl and laid the razor down like an oath. By afternoon, a cart creaked toward the cemetery with a weight that sobered even the curious. Round Rock's burying ground crouched beneath live oaks, whose roots held secrets older than the railroad. It received the outlaw first, then the day's other dead, without ceremony beyond the old human motions. Lower, pause, cover. A few stood back, hats in hand, and watched the earth take what gunfire had given. If any speech was offered for Sam Bass, it came out plain. The way men speak over someone they can't fit into a single word. Unlucky, reckless, loyal, wrong. Seaborn Barnes would follow him into that plot. The two of them a matched lesson about speed and the arithmetic of July. Deputy A.W. Cage Grimes had his own place, as the law should. The separation did not keep their stories apart. Cemeteries with short fences never do. For a while, people came, because people always come. Some prayed, some stared, some simply stood long enough to feel the day melt from their shirts and then drifted away, as if ashamed of having looked too long at a kind of intimacy that isn't theirs to own. Then the pilgrims changed. Curiosity replaced grief, and the patient stone took the first nicks from penknives. Souvenir hunters chipped at the marker as if legends were limestone you could pocket. The cuts multiplied until the town understood that a grave in Texas needs more than grass to protect it, and the modest slab gave way to a stronger sign, an obelisk of certainty where gossip could not bite through. The replacement was both apology and admission. We do not always know how to behave in the presence of a story that still has heat in it. Round Rock's map began to absorb the standoff, the way a family absorbs a difficult memory. Quietly but not secretly. A stretch of asphalt became Sam Bass Road. Another, A.W. Grimes Boulevard. The names met where errands met, where people pulled into grocers and schools and hardware lots with nails and paper sacks. The past was written across the present's errands, not as a lecture, but as a label. Children in the back seats learned to spell the dead without noticing. Directions were given by saying an outlaw's name or a deputy's, and the caller on the other end of the line understood exactly which way to turn. A town picks who to remember and how, and sometimes it remembers both sides of an argument, so the argument can go on without anyone having to raise their voice. The Rangers rode out of Round Rock, leaner for the fight and fuller in reputation. Major John B. Jones, who had fired one careful round and then settled back to the logic of command, turned his men toward the next duty. He had not gone to war with a character from a song. He had gone to close a season of train robberies that embarrassed the state. The Frontier Battalion, under his hand and others, entered the annals not as a troop of theatrical horsemen, but as a system with a saddle. Companies drilled to patience and speed, answerable to civil law, able to gather rumor into placement and placement into result. Their success was not the romance that dime novels loved. It was the steadying that towns demanded. Round Rock gave them a chapter the public could understand at a glance. A store, a bell, deputies and rangers holding a noisy line where a quiet one failed. What they carried forward was a lesson more boring and therefore more durable. Information wins, and discipline keeps what information wins. But the West is a long listener. It hears news and turns it into something that can be sung. Before the grass had learned the shape of Bass's stone, verses were traveling faster than the train he once halted. Sam Bass was born in Indiana. And the lines after, sometimes rueful, sometimes admiring, depending on the singer's supper and politics. The ballad made a choice the newspapers had already rehearsed. It leaned toward charm. It didn't glorify blood. It glorified the audacity to reach for coin traveling through the night and then fade into the brush unhurt. Songs want their outlaws unserious, at least until the last verse. Grief is poor melody. So Bass became the kind of figure a fiddle can carry. Young, daring, loyal to his code. The dead deputy's family heard those same verses and learned, if they hadn't already, how the Republic of Memory can be unfair without meaning to be. Town memory answered with its own counterweight. Ceremonies for the fallen. A badge polished every year by hands that knew its weight. A school child asked to read out the names at a wreath laying. At Copperell's old corner, people pointed and argued amiably about which ranger had fired the mortal shot. Dick Ware from the Barbers, George Herold from a steadier distance, each telling drawing a different moral about speed and aim, neither eliminating the other. Round Rock learned to live with ambiguity the way frontier places learn to live with drought. You keep two explanations in the pantry so you can eat if either crop fails. The point, after enough years, wasn't to pick. It was to remember that a town held together under fire and still made room for a barber to finish his day's work and for a woman to carry a basin to a bleeding man. Elsewhere, the old Chisholm feeder crossing silted its legend into the creek as rails pulled the town's commerce to the south. Old Town didn't vanish. It never does. But the scent of the future favored timetables and invoices, and Round Rock grew into itself in the direction iron had pointed. The standoff stands now like a hinge in that transformation. Trail custom meeting town statute, six-gun habit meeting a clerk's insistence that business can be transacted without fear. You can argue that the crack of guns in '78 announced not only the end of a robber's run, but the start of a more settled Texas, where an office could balance its books while a ranger drank coffee on the porch, and the telegraph chattered through the afternoon without anyone thinking it was pulling fate by the sleeve. And yet the need for story remains. Visitors still wander the cemetery and run their fingers, gently now, over letters that give up nothing beyond what stone can say. A docent tells the tale and lets the ending sit a second longer on the air than modern attention spans prefer. The docent has learned the trick every good historian knows. You offer the bones of the event, the dates, the names, the cartridges. Then you allow the living to feel how breath and motive once moved inside those bones. This is not indulgence. It is defense against amnesia. Without it, everything hard becomes a postcard. In the courthouse records, you can read the cool version. Warrants, arrests, inquests, the handwriting neat where the hand was trained by older men who had also watched July lengthen over a town. In the music, you hear the warmer version, sung in kitchens and at the back of saloons that sell more nostalgia than rye now. In the street signs, you see the municipal version, neutral and stubborn, as if the council had said, let the children carry both names on their tongues and sort the rest out later. The West has always been a chorus, law, song, ledger. Round Rock happened to gather all three in 1 week and never quite set them down again. Sometimes in a season when the air feels like the let-up to rain, a man walking past the corner where the store stood will stop and look at nothing in particular. If you asked, he might say the street sounded different just then, as if it remembered boot heels that weren't his. We are never far from our own reenactments. A deputy straightening his coat to keep a badge from flashing is kin to a clerk flipping the sign to open at 8 sharp. A ranger sipping coffee with his hat tipped down is cousin to a woman setting her child's hand on a headstone and whispering the syllables of a name that once frightened her grandmother. The continuity is the point. It tells a town what kind of place it has been, so it can decide what kind of place to be. Round Rock decided in the end to carry both truths, that a young outlaw bled out his last stubbornness in a shack near the crossroads, and that a lawman died because he told 3 strangers to yield their pistols inside city limits. The myth makers and the record keepers share the same shade now at the cemetery, where live oaks give room for both kinds of memory. The creek goes on saying its piece over the limestone lip, where cattle once found their footing. Freight hums where the rails go, and a late commuter glances up at a street sign without thinking he is speaking the dead aloud. The ballad lingers, and so does the ledger. Between them stands the town, unchanged in the way true places are unchanged. It remembers. In the end, the thing that tips a moment from noise into history is almost never a flourish. It is paperwork and habit. The standoff at Round Rock satisfies ballad writers because it has smoke and speed and the tidy geometry of a doorway. But the reason a deputy put his hand to the bell in the first place was ink. Black ink, dried years before on a page in Austin. In 1871, the legislature wrote a stern instruction into Texas life. The public bearing of pistols would not rule the streets. The statute did not make the frontier gentle, it made the frontier legible. Towns took that language into their bylaws and their bones. A badge could walk up to 3 strangers and ask for their sidearms, not as a dare, but as a civic chore, like checking weights or closing shutters before a gale. When Ahijah W. K.G. Grimes stepped through Copperell's door, he was not rehearsing a duel, he was performing a rule. The frontier was turning into a place where law did its best work in the quiet seconds before any man had to raise his voice. That is why Round Rock, not Dallas. The big depots north of the Trinity had given Bass a year's worth of headlines and small hauls, but they also taught the Rangers how a crowd swallows an outlaw whole. Track noise, freight wagons, night shifts, far too many corners. A smaller town gave the gang what gamblers crave, simplicity, and at the same time gave Jones what commanders need, control. Fewer doors to watch, fewer alleys to mind, a rhythm to the traffic you could learn in an afternoon. Bass saw a bank he could take before anyone worked up a fuss. Jones, fed by letters in Jim Murphy's careful hand, saw a grid he could cover with 6 or 8 men and a couple of county badges without turning the place into a carnival. The pistol law added one more hinge to the plan. Let the law announce itself at the threshold, and if necessary, let the Rangers be the answer that comes after the announcement. The story loves to pretend that fate chose Round Rock for its symmetry. Trail past meeting rail tomorrow at a creek named by a stone. Truth is plainer. Bass chose it because he believed he could be ordinary there for half an hour, and Jones chose it because he believed Bass would try. The town was a seam, old and new stitched close together, and seams either hold or split. The bell over the door told you which. There is a second ledger open under the first one, the one filled in ink. In that deeper book lie customs and codes, the old obligations men carried when statute and timetable had not yet learned to speak with authority. Bass's refusal to blow on my pals belongs there. It is not a polite sentiment. It is a working rule from a life where betrayal returns the long way around, wearing someone else's face. He held that rule through 3 days of heat and morphine and questions. You can damn the code for what it cost the law. You can admire it for the steel it required. Either way, it is part of the country's inheritance. Texas learned to be a state by absorbing such ethics and refashioning them into terms a court could live with. Witness oaths, jury boxes, a badge that is answerable not to a single man's dare, but to a chain of authority that runs from a clerk's blotter to a governor's pen. And what of the man who rode away while the town stitched itself back together? Frank Jackson's trail goes dim the way a creek disappears under limestone and runs for a while where only roots can hear it. Some said he got Bass into the brush and then slipped south, changing names with his hat. Others swore he made New Mexico or the Indian Territory and grew old under another sun, the West having forgiven him the way it forgives any rider who refuses to stand still long enough to be judged. There are even voices that try to fold him back into Mexico because it suits the imagination to send the loyal man across a border the law cannot easily police. The record can't bless any of it with certainty. Perhaps that is right. A partner who carried a wounded friend out of a killing street has earned whatever quiet the world will grant him. The town never settled the other quarrel either, the bullet that counted. Some hold to Dick Ware, the ranger who ran half-shaved into the light and put a fatal shot into Seaborn Barnes before turning, perhaps the same iron toward Bass at close quarters. Others nod toward George Herold, the rifleman posted steady downrange, whose single careful round may have found the outlaw as he and Jackson fought their saddles in the alley's glare. You can choose Ware for the sprint or Herold for the patience, and you will be arguing a preference about how order should behave under fire. Round Rock learned the adult lesson instead. You don't need one name in ink to keep faith with a story. Sometimes the truth is a pair of hands doing the same work from different angles. Step back and the picture widens beyond a single town and a single July. The 1870s drew a line across the Southwest. Telegraph atop trail, statute atop custom, timetable atop guesswork. The Rangers who rode under Major John B. Jones were not the last word on law, but they were the persuasive sentence in a paragraph that included local sheriffs, county courts, grand juries, newspaper editors, and merchants who wanted to lock their doors at sundown and kiss their children without thinking about sidearms. The discipline Jones prized, quiet placements, borrowed eyes in porches and feed stores, the refusal to turn every arrest into a parade, proved a better remedy for outlawry than any single hot-handed gun. Round Rock offered that proof in a form the public could see. A bell, a badge, a volley, then the careful work of carrying the wounded into shade and writing the names down right. Was he a Robin Hood, people still ask? Because stories ask for shape the way a body asks for sleep. The ledger answers without malice. No. Base robbed for Bass, and for the habit of risk that had been paying him small wages since Denton. But the same ledger grants him qualities that complicate the verdict. Good humor, undeniable nerve, and a loyalty that held even when it stopped serving his interest. The documentary record will keep the arithmetic straight. The song will keep the curve of the line plausible. The town will keep the corners where each version touches ground. That is how a free people remember, through disagreement repeated kindly across generations until the edge is smooth and what remains is useful. The pistol law that shaped Grimes's decision did not rid Texas of violence. It taught Texas how to conduct its quarrels under an agreed light. In that light, a barber can put down a razor and find that his role is to reopen at 9 tomorrow, balanced between a ranger's sprint and a widow's grief. In that light, a child can rehearse the names on a headstone without learning to fear her own street. In that same light, an historian can say plainly that a young outlaw died because he tested a town that had decided to belong to the future. Why not Dallas? Because the future often proves itself in the small places first. A big city absorbs a legend. A little town has to live beside it. Round Rock chose to live beside its legend by naming both sides of it, Sam Bass Road and A.W. Grimes Boulevard, and by letting citizens argue at leisure over Ware and Herold and the barber's lather and every other bright thread. You will not find a jury impaneled for that. You will find instead what the West has always relied on after the dust: a porch, a late light, and an audience willing to hear the long version. Stand, if you like, at Brushy Creek when the water is low, and lay your palm on the flat stone that guided wagons and cattle hooves before the rails arrived. It is not a shrine, it is a tool left over from an older job. The standoff was another tool, a moment when the state tried its hand at saying, "Here is how we mean to live together from now on." The attempt was imperfect. Attempts always are, but it held. The town kept its commerce. The Rangers kept their patience. The court kept its dates. The song kept its air. Somewhere under all of that, the ledger kept ticking, unromantic and incorruptible, adding a credit for courage here, a debit for folly there, and a running balance for the hard fact that men can be loyal and wrong at the same time. If you insist on a final sum, try this one. Round Rock did not end the West. It put a frame around it sturdy enough to hang in a courthouse hallway and plain enough to live by. The rest is maintenance, sweeping the steps, teaching the children the names, arguing amiably in the shade about a shot taken from a doorway or a rifle rest, and checking, now and then, that the bell above the store rings for ordinary business again.